Some reason people they have like a table. They'll have private.
Yeah.
Good morning. Let's get started. So yes, there are indeed a variety of eggs that are hidden throughout campus. So best of luck if you're searching for them. It's kind of fun. Hope that your week is going well. Today is our last class meeting before we have our employment interviews. This is also your last chance to work with your partner in class. So I encourage you, any other preparation that you need to do for this assignment, you can do just by talking to your partner outside of class, setting up a meeting, maybe using a Google Doc or email. Just make sure you both are in the loop. Let me know if you have problems with being in contact with your partner in preparation for this assignment. So last class, we wrapped up our discussion about employment interviews, including looking at an example and some best practices. We talked about some of the ways you can open and close employment interviews effectively in a way that's emphasizing a focus on professionalism, clarity, and really offering people the resources that they need, right? As an interviewee, you should be coming into this interview being ready with questions for your employer. And that's something you should be prepared to do in professional settings that really helps you to stand out positively. For today, as you're thinking about preparing for this assignment, right, make sure that both you and your partner know about what it is that you are applying for. Again, you and your partner can apply for different things. I just encourage you to take the time to make sure your partner knows what you're applying for, what material you might use to apply, the kinds of questions that you might be expected to answer, and so forth. Again, think about the use of the guide and brief as a way to really help to structure and prepare for possible probes. In particular, right, the interview brief, where you as an interviewee are coming in with possible answers or examples you can give to questions, is a really great resource, because when you're actually doing a job interview, if you're doing it over Zoom or in a phone call, right, there might be certain details that you have written down that you can return to and make sure that you're using it in your interview. You don't want to seem like you're reading, but it can be really useful to have that information on deck so you jog your memory and remember what you need to talk about. So this is a good way to help you to prepare for professional interviews you might do in the future. So I mentioned some of the frequently asked questions in employment interviews. Again, I encourage you, if you're thinking about some of those, to take them a bit further, right, and to adapt a bit more structure or detail. For example, talking a little bit more about the specific goals to the job if you're asking a question about short and long range career goals. So these can be starting points, but not necessarily the level of depth in what you're looking for in the answers, right? When you're interviewing people, you get out what you put in. So asking questions that are detailed, that are specific, that are really helping to separate out candidates and understand who you would be hiring if you choose to hire somebody, I think is really important. And when we talked about responding, right, we talked about some of the ways in which you can use really clear, straightforward language, making sure to show your kind of command and confidence in the interview process, right? While you want to show humility and show ownership of things, you also want to take ownership of the things that you've done well. Good interview is not a regurgitation of the things that you said on your application. It's a chance to take things a bit further and connect the parts of your application together in a story and an experience that helps people to learn about you. So for today, we're going to be talking a bit about the performance interview. This is a different type of interview, but it's one that's very connected to employment interviews. I think is a useful thing for us to be aware of as we are moving forward and talking about different types of interviews in the course. So we'll be talking about and doing an activity related to performance interviews, and then we'll have a block here at the end of the class for you to work with your partner one last time on preparing for your employment interviews starting on Friday. Just as a reminder, on the front page of Canvas, you'll notice that there is the schedule that is linked through announcements, right? So the employment interview schedule and prompt, again, starting on Friday, going into Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of the following week. Also, you are able to submit your interview brief and guide. So the employment interview brief and guide is under announcements, and I'll also add a link on the front page of Canvas where you can submit both of those as well. So let's talk a little bit about the performance review interview, right? So the performance interview is a type of interview that's connected, but I think is another type of interview that's good for us to know about. We will be doing, after the employment interviews, a final round where we'll go over different types of interviews, and you'll get to choose from a number of options. So I think it's good for us to understand performance interviews, especially because, right, you're applying for jobs, you're being considered for jobs, and wow, you finally got a job. Like you've landed something great. One of your concerns, if it's a good fit for you, you enjoy the job, you enjoy the pay, is being able to remain in the job and feeling like you're doing a good job, that your supervisor respects you, you might even be considered for something like a promotion, right? So one of the challenges here is how we engage in a performance interview. You might be familiar with something like an annual performance review, where in a lot of jobs, a supervisor is going to survey you, look at how you've been doing, typically every year, and see, what's working well. Are you on track? Are you not? Right? Faculty at UU, we do that too. Every spring, our boss or dean typically will do a performance interview with us. And the purpose of this, from the role of an interviewer, is to review the employee, how they've been doing, what's been going on, what's been working well, what hasn't. And the goal of a performance interview is in many ways to be future oriented, right? This is not necessarily about what, making mistakes and acknowledging and blowing up problems that the employee has done. Instead, a really good performance interview is moving forward. It's saying, yes, these problems have happened. There have been some behavior issues or some performance issues with you as an employee, but our goal is to develop a plan and develop a strategy that helps you to effectively move forward and, do a better job, basically, right? So in many ways, this is diagnostic, right? It's diagnosing and trying to deal with a problem, understand what's not going well, and figure out if an employee has the resources and support to make the changes that are needed. For example, sometimes you take about a week to respond to an email. I'm worried about your ability to timely respond. What is impacting your ability to do that? And maybe you discover that somebody has really major issues with their technology, computer access, with internet access, and you develop a plan to help them to get better access to those things, right? Performance interview is not just about things that might not be going well. It's about acknowledging and supporting things that are really good, right? You as an employee are doing a great job providing good outreach, of being engaged, of being supportive. And as a result of that, we want you to continue to do that, right? So highlighting what's working well and isn't is a really big goal here from the role of an interviewer. And from the role of an interviewee, right, if you are receiving a performance interview, if you're engaging with the boss or supervisor, it's a chance for you to really highlight your strengths, the things that have been going well, things you've been doing well, and really to sell yourself in a similar way to how you've sold and presented yourself as a potential employee in an employment interview. So in this way, right, you can think about a performance interview as being focused on coaching, right? It's catalytic insofar as an interview is a catalyst, sometimes a kick in the pants, sometimes cheerleading, right? To encourage you to continue to do something or change something in how an employee is behaving, right? So you might find yourself in a leadership or mentor position. And as a result of that, you find yourself doing a performance interview. So the goal here is, again, to be future-oriented, to support an employee or person that's working under you to help them to develop the skills to go forward. So the goal of coaching, right, is to be respectful, to be supportive of the person. Sometimes you can kind of submit pre-information, like ask an employee to share and highlight their own reflection, what works well, what hasn't, and use that to guide the conversation. Again, it's not about finger pointing and saying you did this, this, and this wrong. It's instead saying, here's what's been going well, here's what hasn't, here's a plan for the future in terms of addressing and dealing with these issues. So one thing to think about here is that while there's not necessarily a set of legal requirements for performance interviews that are specific to those, the equal employment opportunity, right? This is something that is present in employment interviews, right? It's the reason you can't ask discriminatory questions. on the basis of something such as somebody's sex, gender identity, and so on. All of the EEO regulations and policies apply here, right? So for instance, if somebody were to critique somebody on the basis of their gender, or to say, oh, well, you're pregnant, you haven't been doing a good job because you're pregnant, and that person has been following all of the legal protections that they have been given, that would fall outside of the EEO, not be considered legal. So it's important as we're thinking about performance interviews in the same way, it's about their performance. It's about assessing all employees. And one way to do this is to create some type of guideline or way of measuring performance that's equal, that's across the board, right? So everybody is being measured, for instance, on their timeliness, on the quality of their writing and work, and so forth. So you have a set of criteria that you're using on everybody rather than like subjectively targeting and singling out people in a way that might put them on the spot. So coaching is very much the focus here of these styles of interviews. Yeah, as an employer or boss, ideally your goal is to help and support somebody. It's good for retention, right? It keeps people on board if they're feeling supported and they feel like they have the resources they need to succeed. And it's also good for an employee because we feel a lot better when we feel like there are things that we can do that we have the power to change, right? One thing that's common as a good strategy whenever you're offering constructive criticism and feedback on somebody is don't make it about don't identify personal qualities or behaviors, for example, saying, oh, well, you are unorganized or you are unreliable, right? Instead of it being about personality, have it be about actions and behaviors that the person has done. When you show up 5 minutes late to meetings, this hurts our ability to move forward, and this needs to be addressed. So making it as tangible as possible, what it is that you're encouraging somebody to improve upon is really important. So performance interviews can take a variety of different forms, depending upon the type of situation that somebody finds themselves in. They might be doing a different style of performance interview, but I want to go over some of these in a bit of detail. One of them is what's known as BARS, or behaviorally anchored rating scales. This is a way in which the skills and the ability to meet the skills and qualifications are assessed, right? So this is an example here in an evaluation form of BARS where there's specific things such as communication, problem-solving ability, teamwork, and so on, where the candidates are all assessed in that same way. So it's about determining, based on the things that are needed for the job, are those things being met? Management by objectives. This is the format that is very much focused on goals, right? What is it that the person is doing? What activities have they been taking on? And what feedback do you have about them? So one way of thinking about this is perhaps you, between employee and employer, create a set of goals for what you hope to accomplish and do in the next year. You look back at those goals at the end of the year, you see to what degree are those being or not being met, and then using that as a means of continuing to work forward productively. So there's also what's known as the universal performance interviewing model. Again, if you're looking for a very clear starting point and a common way that these performance interviews are conducted, this way is to present a series of questions. What's not being done that should be? So what are the things that employees have been asked to do? Perhaps they've been asked to come to the office and they haven't been able to do so consistently. What expectations are not being met at what standards? So within the job description and responsibilities, what isn't happening, the degree that it could be. Can the person do it if they're motivated, right? If the person understands that they're not doing the thing that they're being asked to do, and do they have the skills to do that and to address that issue, right? So you find yourself, dealing with a performance interview and you find that you're being critiqued for something, right? Making it focused on, okay, I understand, I want to take this to heart, here are the steps that I can take, right? To be really useful here. And then the 360 interview is generally present in organizations that have a lot of subgroups and people. Sometimes it means that there's different people who are evaluating you and overall coming together to offer an assessment. For instance, if you're up for a promotion, you've submitted an application, there might be multiple people who are working together to evaluate you in different ways. So these models are useful as you're thinking about this. Again, this is helpful because we're going to find ourselves in jobs where we're evaluated, and we're probably going to find ourselves in positions where we're mentoring and evaluating other people. So it's important for us to think about this, right? It can be scary, like asking to be put in the office or asking to be sat down for a performance interview, but I think it's useful to understand the goals, the purpose, and why they're set up the way that they are. So there's a few different issues that can come about in these style of interviews that I think are really important to think about from both perspectives. One of them is, you really, just like for an employment interview, you really want to get an honest look at the person and at that person's qualifications. Right. So one thing that can be a problem is a halo effect. So sometimes, and I've done this as well, sometimes an employee will be really good and really show how good they are at one thing as an effort to compensate for other things that they might be struggling with. So for instance, maybe your employee is really quick at answering emails, but they're not quite as good at getting some of the larger products in on time. So the halo effect is we look at somebody who's talented at one thing, good at one thing, and we think, oh, that's meaning that they're talented in all areas. This person is really good at tech. They're really good at resolving these technology issues. So they must be great interpersonally. And then we discover, oh, wow, they are very hostile and aggressive toward their coworkers. So it's important for us to look at the different categories and things that they do and not assume that being good at one thing is going to spill over into other things, right? If our goal is to help employees work together and to address issues, we need to be careful about the halo effect and not attributing the possible issues that might be happening in other places. Secondarily, there's the opposite, right? It's known as the pitchfork effect, right? So you can think about the contrast of the two, almost like the shoulder angels and devils, right? That tell you you're doing the right or wrong thing. The pitchfork effect is suggesting that because somebody is bad or ineffective at one thing, that means that they are bad at everything. So we assume somebody comes in late, or maybe they're not answering emails or messages effectively. Therefore, they're not a good worker. But then we look at the quality of their work, the quality of their relationships, and they do a great job. All that to say, it can be easy for an employer to be biased and to look at the small pieces and think, oh, this person's great or not so great. One of the challenges as an employee, right, is to push back and say, there might be this one thing that I know I'm struggling with, but overall, I'm doing a good job. Here's why. So central tendency, right? So measures of central tendency are common in a lot of different forms of research, particularly in using quantitative data-driven research. So central tendency, one of the challenges is that it's too focused on what the middle is. Like, are you at this standard or are you exceeding the standard? So you might want to think carefully about how you're measuring candidates. What is the standard or expectation that people are considering? Like ability to communicate, ability to work in teams, that sort of thing. There's also what's known as a recency error, right? So one challenge is that oftentimes a performance interview, it happens once a year. So there's generally a pretty big gap in these kinds of interviews. So sometimes an employer or boss is more likely to look at recent activity. What has that person been doing lately, right? So one trick that you can do as an employee is to prepare and to have kind of things that you can speak to that you've done from the whole year. Or as an employer, you can review and assess the activities that somebody has done over the course of the full year, or ask an employee to reflect on the full year, right? You are reviewing for that period of time. You're not reviewing for the month before you had to do the performance review. There can also be errors in assessment, right? So sometimes there are people who might review in a very loose way where they are very generous in how they assess people. Sometimes you have what are considered to be tight raters that tend to be very, I'm not going to give somebody a 10 unless they're absolutely flawless. And we have to also consider sometimes there can be conflict of interest and competition. Maybe your employer sees you as a potential threat and they're more willing to rate you lower. So sometimes there can be problems in how these issues are being assessed. So I think it's important as you're thinking about this to, as a person who might be giving this interview, consider and offset potential bias. So the contrast here, so a performance interview is standard. Again, a lot of bosses are going to do this, sometimes in a very informal way. Like they sit down and talk to you just about how things are doing. Sometimes you're in what's known as a probationary period, maybe for the first month or 3 months. They can fire you at any time, but they kind of do an assessment after a 1 month or 3 month period to talk about how you're doing and decide if you're able to stay with them in a longer term capacity. So the difference between a standard performance interview and a performance problem interview is, well, there's a problem. There's an issue that's come up that has required somebody to be brought in for an interview. Perhaps they lashed out, behaved in a way that was inappropriate. There was a severe issue that occurred. So what do we do? So performance problem interview has cause for issue. There is a thing that is bringing somebody in. And it's important for an employer to be as concrete as possible about what that issue is. Shouldn't be gossip, rumors, hearsay. It should be something that's clear that is impacting their ability to do the job. This should be encouraging and future focused, right? This is about trying to establish a plan for the future. How do we deal with this problem? How do we address this issue? Again, as an employer, you want to have a witness, just cause, reason to believe that the thing happened, or else it becomes an easy he said, she said. People are claiming that the problem did or didn't happen. So make sure that whatever issue you're bringing in is as concrete as possible. So some of the ways that people prepare in an employment problem interview is to comply and show like support within the problem, right? To really kind of acquiesce and say, hey, I recognize the problem. I'm going to try to really focus on this in the future. Sometimes it's using relational leverage, like using the relationship that an employer-employee have. You know me, I wouldn't do something like that, right? Sometimes that can be used as a strategy to try to not take responsibility. Providing an alibi, I wasn't here at the time this happened, and sometimes avoiding, just not talking about or changing the subject to cover. So I think it's important to try to recognize and offset potential ways that people get around problems, right? The best way to do this, if you yourself are experiencing a performance problem interview, is to be honest about what occurred from your perspective and develop a plan on how you're addressing that in the future. And as a person who's interviewing and assessing, oftentimes it's a really good idea to take into account all the relevant perspectives and individuals who are involved in the process, and to avoid jumping to a conclusion too soon. Hear people out, hear their perspective, and develop a plan of action on how you're going to address that. Wanted to share a kind of funny example here. It was a fun little example of Conan and Brian doing a performance interview of his employees to show some of the things that we shouldn't do in a performance interview, and just to highlight some of the fun things in the format in a little bit more detail.
Someone who runs a company, I've been told it is my job to occasionally have performance reviews. I've asked for some assistance from my script supervisor. This is Danielle Weisberg. Hello, Danielle. Hi. You're a script supervisor, you know?
Yeah.
Where are you?
Law assistant.
Oh, what does script supervisor do?
That's Susie.
Who's Susie? Name, please.
No.
What is your title position?
Photographer.
Photographer. And still needs to talk.
Yeah.
You seem defensive, are you?
A little bit.
Wow.
Because you're questioning my position at the show.
Hey, in no way do I want you to feel nervous about this. Okay. This is just to decide whether or not you should be fired or not. What's your group? Is your gender?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I just have 3 employees today. It's just the way it is. This is the staff and crew. Colin, would you please identify the 3 people you think should go? Who's that?
George
Steve. Okay. No time and maybe you already complaints for me the way that I run show. I'm not even person to fix tonight. And last years walking up behind women, massaging their shoulders and sitting down his home. Give you 10% raise. not really wanting to do that. You are really a rich and here to show and at home.
So, example here of things you should not do in a performance interview, right? Don't know who the employee is or what their qualifications are. Obviously, unwanted physical contact is not okay. Making kind of like presenting it as, oh, well, trying to figure out if you're going to get fired, right? Like those types of questions and framing is not how you want to present the environment. In many ways, highlighting the problems of, how if we put somebody on the spot, put somebody on defense, that's going to be not a great environment for a performance interview. So good performance interview, right, is about focusing on coaching, focusing on helping the interviewee feel supported, feel empowered, have the resources that they need to succeed, right? Rather than finger waving about what went wrong, it's figuring out a plan of action for the future and helping that person understand what they need to do that. Right? Sometimes it's on you. Sometimes the issue is that somebody doesn't have a resource that they need to do the job. Like they've been waiting for months and months and they don't have a computer in their office. So there's a lot they haven't been able to accomplish. So being honest about that, and also, right, allowing the opportunity for an employee to share the things that might be going wrong on their end and the ways that they can better support and feel supported on the end of the employer. Being open to that is important too. So what I'm going to have you do is take some time on your own to work on your attendance activity for today. This is a scenario that I'm asking you to think about. And then once you have finished this as your attendance prompt of the day, you're welcome to spend the rest of class to work with your partner in preparation for the employment interview. So in this scenario, I'm asking you to think about a profession of your choosing. So pretend that you have been working here and involved for a while at whatever job you're interested in. And you are being asked to conduct a performance review of one of your coworkers or an employee that works under you. What model of the performance interviews that we've talked about so far in the class, these 4 different approaches, would you want to use for this interview? And why of those 4 are you selecting that one? What's a pitfall or problem in conducting performance interviews? How are you going to avoid that problem? And what kind of preparation are you interested in doing to just make sure that conducting this performance interview goes well? And then once you finish that, you're welcome to work with your partner or do any prep on your own that you need to do for your interview. So take some time to think about this, write or type for your attendance for the day. And after that, you'll have time with your partner. Again, as you're wrapping up, once you're done, you're welcome to check in, chat with your partner. You've completed your prompt and you and your partner are set. You can stick around as long as you like, or if you are ready, you're welcome to head out sooner. Thanks.
At least you know now. I know nothing about being a marketing guy. I'm really saying. I'd love to hear that. Good.
You live with.
If you like little right now.
No, I have to wear mine.
Go like this, look at it, like that. Do that for him. Doesn't he turn out all the-
That would have been. You ready for? We're going to be.
Yeah.
We're going to do this after. I literally. No, they're not.
Thank you.
I think that I think we can achieve it good.
Yeah, like, oh, awesome. Yes.
Are you up with the rest?
Whatever. I think I just remember here and I pulled my questions out.
Oh, God.
One day.
Yeah, so are you doing not related about
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
I mean, kind of not in.
I'm actually excited for it.
What's the difference? I have.
Yeah, I gotta put it up. You know what I'm saying?
Little creepy.
What unlimited?
But like.
You don't play me in the world. I'm supposed to do. Play me.
Oops, sorry.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Edward. So take a couple more minutes to finish up. Again, you're welcome to use this room until my next class at 11.
G. And my papa. Shoot. I mean, there's just another video. I understand. But it's very long to play. Yeah. I mean, I guess. So we have no idea what the. Yeah, it don't matter. We'll see it. We'll see it. My turn.
Wrapping up, talked a little bit about performance interviews. They'll be one of the 4 options you can choose for your final interview at the end of the term. And then day 1, we've got these pairs who will be your